Thank you all for coming. We're going to walk through just a few things today that will not be earth-shattering. You're not going to learn any like new secrets that aren't out. People who have been through sort of either some education on loss and grief, or just have been self-reflective about it. Probably you're not going to discover anything particularly new, but we are going to walk together a little bit through, especially through this understanding that life is made up of attachments and losses, and that without them, life is not possible. You know, so it's not just what I want to try and lay the groundwork for today is not only have we all experienced loss, but loss is fundamentally built into the reality that we live in. And if we can embrace that and learn to walk through that and confront that, then that leads to a different kind of path. And it helps to kind of unstop and unplug some of the blockages that get in the way of things. A lot of this is based off of a book called All Our Losses, All Our Griefs by Kenneth Mitchell and Herbert Anderson. It's been out for a long time. It's got some great stuff in it about how fundamental this is to us as human beings, and also when we fail to recognize kind of the part or the role that loss plays in our lives in all kinds of ways, that can often, like I said, interfere with the way that new life can grow out of that. So there's a great quote: "There is no life without either attachment or loss, hence there is no life without grief." So before we get started, I just wondered what you thought about that statement. It's an interesting one. How is it that there is no life without attachment?
In reproductive time, if the egg doesn't attach, then you got nothing.
That's right. I mean, so you can think biologically about this, right? Attachment is essential. Without the attachment of the placenta, in mammals anyway, right, that egg never even develops. And so attachment is crucial for life to develop. Without plants rooted into the soil or rooted into something, without that attachment, nothing happens. But on the same token, how is it that life, becomes individualized? How is it that one life gives way to another? There has to be separation, which involves loss. So there's a way to think about the beginning of life as a processing of loss. If you want to crawl inside the mind of an infant, they just lost whatever sense of security and in existence. I mean, maybe that's why babies cry for the first time, right? They're like, what in the world just happened? There's a profound loss. But that's a part of the new life that's coming. And also, in the same token, parents experience this new life, but they also have lost their old life. And this is before we even get to the death of anything. So I want you to, what we're going to do is kind of walk through a series of losses and see how all these things come to play in our lives, and then maybe see how when we lose someone we love, all these things are sort of stacked on top of one another. And when we do that, what that does is gives us tools, gives us ability, gives us agency to kind of work through and process, not ever being done with it. Hence, grief is a fundamental part of life. We're never done with that. We're not actually going to get very much to grief today. We're just going to focus on loss, a lot of it. Okay? Loss and grief. So loss is the experience or separation from that which we are attached to. What, just briefly, just shout out the top of your head, things that you're attached to. Grandkids.
Pets.
Pets.
House.
House.
Husband. said husband.
Husband, yes. Place, yeah. Parents. Yeah. Those things that we're attached to, and all kinds of, we are attached to all kinds of things, right? Attachments are necessary for life. You can think of yourself as a complex hub of attachments. That's essentially what creates us. We're stand at the center of all kinds of interactions and relationships, and all of that web, you might think of, defines us as a person. It's hard for me to sometimes use the word individual because we're not separate in that sense. Our individualness is tied up in our connectedness to other people, as strange as that sounds. But attachments are necessary for life. But so too, separation is necessary for individual life. Separation is important. So, who remembers, like, anybody remember an instance where you felt like it was really necessary to separate from your parents? Could be, right? We all have kind of gone through that as people. That there's a need to separate and define for ourselves our own life, right? Those separations are hard. They involve pain, almost always, right? Even the person who feels like they want the separation to happen experiences on some level a kind of loss, even though they may not admit it. But separations are necessary for individual life. It's built into it. And then, of course, life itself is temporary. So all of this is really about, we receive this amazing gift that we call conscious life, right? We're the fundamental particles in this body, right, which are the same thing that's all in this room and on those sandwiches in the back, and but for some reason, all the relationships have come together to make my individual life, your individual life. But all of those relationships one day will end, and this life will end, and a new life will come, and people will have to grieve that loss. And it's been that way forever. So grief, then, is the intentional work that someone does when they've experienced loss so that they can gain a renewed sense of wholeness. Now, notice that it doesn't say wholeness. It's a renewed sense of, right? You don't ever get back to the place that you were. That would sort of discount the fact that something was lost, right? You don't get back to that place. You get to a new place, different place. But grief does allow you to get to a different place than when you're just experiencing the loss. And so grief is work. I like that definition the most. Sometimes it's been steps, sometimes it's been stages. There's some great grief researchers that defined it as work. And I've really landed on that because it takes effort. You don't go in a sequential pattern all the time. You skip around and go here and there and find yourself going back again. But work is movement of an object through a distance, and so grief work moves us from one place to another. The final word that we're going to kind of just talk about is forgiveness, which I feel like is an important part of processing loss. Because forgiveness is also a way of dealing with pain in your life. And loss almost always involves pain. So forgiveness is letting go of the urge to lessen my pain by inflicting more pain on someone else, right? I give up my right to hurt you after you've hurt me. That's one of the most fundamental definitions of forgiveness that I've ever heard. I heard it from, I think, Leo Buscaglia, who used to do a whole lot of stuff on love. Forgiveness is letting go of my sort of righteous need to hurt you when you've hurt me. And I say this because there's a image that's burned in my mind from my first congregation. So we were, a family was was out at the cemetery. They had brought the ashes of the mother, the matriarch in the family. The father had already died. The children were gathered together, and we were on a small town, and so we didn't have the funeral home. We didn't have anything else. We were just there, and we had dug the hole, and we were putting the ashes in, and one of the children took a shovel of dirt and put it on top of the urn and said, "I hope you can learn to forgive in heaven, Mom."
Wow.
Yeah. So you can see the layers of pain and that were a part of that whole process. And yet, in the same time, a note of hopefulness that all this pain that this person had experienced in one way, shape, or form or another might somehow find healing still in the realm of God, that there is a hope, right? So you'll see that how we process loss throughout our life affects how we process loss at the end of our life too sometimes. Okay. Life's a series of losses. So this is built into creation. Attachment and separation are built into creation. Darkness gives way to light, right? Everything was dark. And the Lord said, "Let there be light." And there was light. Guess what? Then it got dark again. You know? So every day, you have to let go of the day before. We've lost that day. Time moves in a linear fashion. We don't get to go back and reclaim it. And so even that is fundamentally built into the way that the world is structured, right? Loss comes. There's another example a little bit. I don't know if you've thought about this way. The human becomes humanity, but there's loss involved. There's a new thing that comes about, but in the kind of poetic way that Genesis has about saying things. This is not about, again, biology, but that there's a loss that leads to a gain. That the human before this happened is not the same human as after, right? So there's a sense that even from the get-go, loss is built into the nature of who we are as human beings. And finally, finitude is built into creation. John Hick, who's a philosopher of religion, I think he died in 2012 or so, he kind of postulated that finitude might even be part of the goodness of creation. So you have Adam and Eve again in the garden, and before they do anything wrong, before they mess up or whatever it is that they do, apart from them is the tree of life. So I know that it's been sort of drilled into our heads that death is the kind of punishment, and I'm not saying that isn't a sometimes good way to think about why death comes to us, but there's also this notion that from the beginning things were not made to be forever, and that part of what defines us as mortals is the temporariness of our life here in this place. And also after things fall apart and Adam and Eve discover that they have broken relationships, one of the things that God does is says, okay, out the garden you go, and we're going to put a limit on lifespans. And you won't have to be in this state, in this brokenness for eternity. That there's a cycle that will be happening. So I think, again, that's part of built into creation. Death may be the dominant way that we experience loss, but it's not the only loss that we experience. And I think in some ways it can be the culmination of losses that we experience. So here's what I'd like you to do now. On your tables, I'd like you to, somebody take a sheet and flip it over. And I'd like you to list out as many different types of losses that you can think of. What are things that people lose? What are losses that people endure throughout life? So I'm going to give you about, I don't know, 5 minutes. So take some time.
As a group.
As a group. Yep, as a group. You can do a group project. Okay, how we coming? Good. So first of all, I'd like somebody. So the person who's writing, just give me a number. How many did you write down?
17.
17.
30.
30. 30. 21. 23. Very good. So if this was confirmation class, we'd be assigning points by table now. Everyone's so competitive. Even about our losses, right? As if it's a good thing that people listed a lot of losses.
I've lost more than you.
Yeah, see, this is how we are, right?
I win.
You know, and that there is something about that because, I mean, loss is individual. It's always personal.
Yes.
But it's not unique in the sense that, I mean, we all experience it, but we all experience it differently. And one person lost, perhaps even of the kind of same thing, is experienced completely differently between two different people, based upon how that thing is, you know,
How the
tied in.
attachments work.
Yeah, based into how it's tied into all of those intersecting webs. And one of the things about loss is it sort of spirals like this, or maybe even spirals like this. When you experience a loss, it can easily trigger you to come back to another time when you experienced a loss. And it may not even be a similar loss. It just might be another time that you've had to work through this feeling of separation and detachment, and like a piece of you is gone. Because the truth is, a piece of you is gone. And that part, although that web, that person or thing or whatever it is occupied is gone, and you can't make it come back. You know, but grief has a way of maybe closing in the web and making it so that you can have a sense of wholeness again. I really love having a sense of wholeness again. Okay, so death is the most profound loss, but that grief is influenced by other losses we have experienced. That's sometimes the way that different people grieve. For instance, sometimes we want to protect children from loss, especially from grief. We want to protect them from it. And that's a totally understandable thing. We think that they aren't able to process things. We don't want them to experience pain. We don't want them to feel hurt or sadness. But when that happens, especially in really poignant cases, like if a small child loses their parent and they're not able to grieve, someone prevents them from doing that, it can really affect how they grieve everything else the whole rest of their life. And so grief, what I'm trying to get at here is that loss and grief is not just a thing that happens to us. It's a part of the world we live in. We swim in it all the time. And in one way, what I'm hoping that can do is help us to embrace the kind of normalcy of loss without denying the pain that comes with it, right? Just because something happens a lot doesn't mean that we should ignore it or wash over it or speed our way through it. But maybe it also helps us to know that we're in the same boat together dealing with this, right? So we can lean on each other and help one another through it. All right, so what I'm going to do now is kind of go through a series of things, and if you've got your papers, I'd like you to put a little, on this first one, put a little M by it. There's probably a lot of things that are going to have an M by it, because the first kind of loss is material loss. I'm going to walk through a couple different kinds of losses. And again, the purpose here is to help us kind of think about how prevalent loss really is in our life and how many different ways that we experience it. So material loss is the loss of a physical object or familiar surrounding that we have a strong attachment to, right? It's usually the first loss we experience as human beings when we're children. You know, something gets taken away from us or we lose it. We've lost something. We lost an object or we've lost a surrounding, right? This also happens with natural disasters, things that are stolen or taken or spoiled. We've lost those things. But it's a thing, it's an object. So children experience material loss intensely, right? Sometimes as adults we can, again, wash over that. But if we fail to take it seriously, or if we emphasize, like, no big deal, we'll just go buy you a new one. We'll just go get a new one. That can lead to this sense of, well, everything can be replaced then, which is obviously not true. So material loss is real loss, and we shouldn't just, gloss over it. And that's part of this too. It's not that every single loss that we encounter as people, we have to walk through a certain step in order to kind of process. Sometimes it's just enough to recognize, oh, that's why I'm feeling this way. I lost this thing. That explains stuff. And then you can move on. Sometimes it's just that recognition that kind of unclogs the pipes, you might say. All right, so I've got M's beside all your material losses. Lots of material losses, I'm sure. All right, next one is R, relationship loss. Relationship loss is the ending of opportunities to relate with in all the ways, right? Talk, love, share. Love's twice in there. Talk, love, share, touch, fight, anything, right? You've lost the ability to relate to this person or be in an emotional or physical presence of a particular person, right? You've lost a relationship. This happens, of course, when you're moving, you have a job change, or a school change, you have a divorce, you have a death. Anybody got any other, what are some other occasions you might experience relationship loss? Retirement, there you go. Yeah, all the people you work with.
Moving to a different church.
Yeah, new church.
I have two grandsons graduating here in the next, in May. One from high school and one from college. And I know one of them is definitely going through an experience of loss. That if I go off to college, I won't see these people.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when we were in the seminary, we saw some of the same people. We had new people, but there were a lot of, so we didn't have to say goodbye. But then all of a sudden, and then when you read the obituaries of them now, and you think, when was the last time I saw them? I remember them in class. I remember, their comments sort of, but I haven't seen them in 50 years.
Yeah.
So that's a loss of companionships.
Right, a loss of relationships.
Yeah.
I think high school graduation is sort of the first big celebrated instance of this. Every high school graduation you go to, the high school, the high schooler who gets up to talk will talk about all the good old times they have, and and now we're going to be off to new things, and they recognize that this is a big thing, right? that they're no longer in high school, they won't be as close, they're kind of going on to new things. But the reality is that just keeps happening over and over and over again in life, right? Yeah. Okay? Relationship loss. These losses are complex. They often intersect with other types of loss, right? Sometimes it's a partial loss. For instance, in a divorce, the nature of the relationship will have changed, but you still may have a relationship with that person. So it's a kind of partial loss. This next one sounds really weird, but hang with me. You can put an I by it. Intrapsychic loss. Intrapsychic loss. So that's an internal experience that you have based on losing an emotionally important image relating to you, right? So this is a little bit like, here, I'll put this up. Thinking like, I'm not me anymore. I had to let go of this dream about what might have been. Or you learn something new about someone else and it changes how you think about them. That's a loss that is occurring inside your head based on how you relate to this person. It happens a lot at retirements too. Yeah. It's a loss of a relationship, but it's a loss of a relationship in your mind, not so much a physical loss of a relationship. Got any ideas about what might fit into that?
What about a loss of hope?
Yeah? That could be a piece of this too. Right, so when you lose hope, you're losing, I think, an ability, and we'll get to that in a minute. This is based on what I heard this morning, that hope is a very active thing, right? And so hope is in some ways, well, many ways, a kind of ability. Right? It's a force. It's a thing that pulls you through. If you lose that, you've lost some ability and some momentum, perhaps. So here's an interesting thing about intrapsychic loss. Even though outward experiences play a role, we experience this internally, and therefore, it's often secret. People don't know. Yeah.
I would see this with parents who were planning on a Gerber baby and had a different child than what
Yeah.
they were looking for. And nobody else knew that.
Yeah, right. So it's some ways it's the loss of there's a role that's coming up too, but this is a little different than that. But it's a loss of how you see yourself or how you see someone else.
That was very present if you did Mary and Martha and Lazarus in today's gospel. When Mary says, "Where were you?"
Yeah.
You can see that loss being evident and that change.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. If you would have been here, this could have all been different. And so that was it's essentially a loss, a processing of separation and detachment.
I think aging has significant intrapsychic loss involved.
Yeah.
I remember the first time, you qualify for the senior discount, right? You look like that, you know?
Yeah.
I know that may seem funny, but it just feels like there's a lot of different ways that I'm aware of finding that
Yeah.
how I see myself
Yeah.
differently.
No, that's very true. And I think this particular kind of loss is important because it points us to the fact that we don't always recognize, that there's a loss happening, even when, because it's not accessible to us, either as a third party or even as your own. It's hard to know. Again, though, if you can sit and talk with someone about these things and identify, oh, that's why I'm feeling this way. Your mind has this remarkable ability, your soul has this remarkable ability to say, okay, once I've identified something, I know how to get through it. It's that initial part of like, I don't know why I'm so mad all the time, or I don't know why I'm, reacting this way. Okay, here's the next one. Functional loss, you can put an F by, and again, these will probably be a lot of them because we're at that point in our lives. Some of us. Functional loss, you've lost a muscular, cognitive, or other bodily function or ability. Anyone in here experience that?
Oh, that was good.
Only you know, God.
Only you know. Only you know all the losses that I've had. I mean, some of them we define that way, right? So I heard the chatter going around about, I mean, we call it hair loss your whole life. We don't say, you know, like scalp gain. We say we call it hair loss. And you have to live with that your whole life. I mean, I've gotten to the point I can laugh a lot about it, but when it started happening when I was in my 20s, it was not fun. And, you know, these things change who we are. I mean, we're constantly doing this. Our abilities are constantly changing. We just don't want to recognize it. And we always think that we always think we have to avoid it and downplay it and
Be a good sport.
Hmm?
Be a good sport.
Yeah, be a good sport, pretend it isn't happening. You know, somehow we're diminished by it if we've lost some ability that makes us less of a person. But again, I want you to understand and embrace the fact that this happens to everybody all the time. It's a part of who we are. Aging, disability, disease, what are other ways that you you have a functional loss? Injury, yeah?
Result of a surgery that's not normal,
Oh,
like they're
yeah.
fixing your knee, but
Could be-
something else happens.
Yeah, could be an accident of a thing or a complication, yeah.
There's also the loss when you lose a partner or someone you've done a lot of things with and you can't do those things anymore.
So you've lost some function because you've lost your help.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Mm.
that's a good one.
I don't know if there's another place where, but somebody mentioned like, you know, infertility and miscarriages.
Yeah, that's probably a functional loss in some ways. Well, there's a lot of you'll see that all of these things are compacted into each other. But certainly, if you want to have a child and you've lost that ability, that's a pretty big functional loss. Yeah. And a whole bunch of others that go with it. Again, this often leads to other losses, including loss of autonomy, which is exactly what you were talking about, which all of us want to keep as long as possible. And we want to deny that we don't have it as long as possible. I mean, this again is part of who we are. Yeah, functional loss. Role loss. You can put an R by here. I think of it as value because how we, especially in culture we live in, our role is also kind of assessed to our value. But role loss is the loss of one specific place or role within a family or business or social network. So probably the prime example is there's a family, they've had a child, and along comes a second one.
Oh, yeah.
The first child experiences role loss, right? They are no longer the center of their parents' world and the only center of their parents' world. They must share it. That's a huge loss.
And when the third one comes along, you got the one in the middle.
Yeah, but it can also
Lose
happen.
twice.
Yeah, it can also happen in the opposite way too. Like a couple wants to have a child and they've lost that ability. Now their role, you know, as parents or as would-be parents has changed. That happens to us when we've lost a spouse or a child. You know, our role in the world is changed. We're no longer defined by our relationship to that person. We have a different role or a different value. But it happens in other ways too, not just there. In business and social networks, you know, you change jobs and you were, I don't know, whatever, vice president of so-and-so at one company and you're, you know, the coordinator of volunteers at another. That's a different role. And that's a loss to work through.
Charlene and I were just saying that you lose you're not a wife.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you're not a wife.
Yeah, that's a huge role change, isn't it?
Yeah.
Especially if you've not thought about that before. Yeah. Yeah, again, retirement changes this. You're not, you know, You're not an engineer, you're not a pastor, you're not a doctor, you're not a whatever it might have been. You're something else now. Even though you haven't left completely all the things you had behind. All right, we're getting close to the end. This is the last one coming up. So the disorientation, uncertainty can lead to behavior changes that are not associated with your previous role, which means you can start acting like a different person because you're not used to the role that you're in. Right? So systemic loss. This is the loss of a familiar functioning of something, of a family, a group, or other system. So things don't work like they used to. The quintessential kind of example of this is when children leave home. Your system is upset, or someone leaves the office, or there's a change in the organization structure or personnel. Things just aren't the same since, Sally left, or whatever it might be. And you're grieving the way that things used to be. The Israelites took off into the wilderness. They had all kinds of losses they were grieving. But one of them was, well, this ain't so great. I'd rather go back to the enslavement system that we had before. Right? Because this can have negative, you see this a lot too with people who are struggling to get out of negative or unhealthy systems. The minute they try to break out of that, things feel weird and uncertain, and it's like, as strange as it sounds, it feels more comfortable to go back to the way things were, even though that wasn't really healthy. You see that in abusive situations or addictive situations or a lot of other kinds of things. And we don't allow people to grieve that loss, to say, I know it's hard to get out of that. And I know that things are going to feel really strange. It's not going to feel like great all of a sudden. To help people work through that can be a really life-giving thing. Okay, that's related to relationships, but it focused on the whole more than the person. For example, if you're concerned more about how a person's behavior is affecting the family than how it affects the individual, then you're grieving a systemic loss. And then I'm going to just run through this very quick. There's lots of variabilities. We're not going to look through all these, but these are the ways that all these things can change, right? So things can be avoided or not. They can be temporary, they can be permanent. They can be anticipated, they can become completely out of the blue. They can be actual losses, or they can just be imagined ones, meaning you perceive it as a loss, even though you've never really lost that. Like, we do that with relationships all the time. We assume someone doesn't want to relate to us anymore, and we feel like we've lost that relationship. But in actuality, that's not true from their perspective. They might want to relate to us just as much as they always have, but we perceive it to be a loss. And also, finally, there's a big difference between, if you think about it as separation, did I leave or was I left? There's a huge difference in how you process that loss. Yeah. So last thing here is just going to be talking about that grieving loss is a sacred thing. It's holy work. To not grieve is to not attach. And that devalues the connectedness of God within all things. Better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, right? And again, this is part of a recognition of how God has structured the world. Grieving loss is a part of it, and it's a holy thing. And if we look at Scripture, we see this over and over again. God grieved. The Lord was sorry that humankind was on the earth and messing things up so much. It grieved God to the heart. It's a whole book I read about that one verse. Grieved God to the heart. And then Isaiah talks about when the people are separate from God and they're going their own ways and they're not, following God's will. The Lord has called you like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit. So the Lord takes up this stance of a woman who's been shunned by someone. And this is how God is grieving. It goes on to say, like the wife of a man's youth who is cast away, like for no good reason. This is how God feels. That's a pretty deep grief. Pretty deep grief. Jesus looked around This is when he's looking at Jerusalem. And he was grieved at the hardness of their hearts. And then, of course, we heard today, Jesus began to weep at the tomb of Lazarus. And the Jews said, see how he loved him. There's grief there, a loss. Even though in the very next few verses, there's going to be a kind of reconstitution of Lazarus, there's some loss that happened because what's coming is not the same as what was. And Jesus enters into that grief. Then Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. And finally, he's grieved in Gethsemane. I'm deeply grieved. To death. Remain here and stay awake. Grief is holy work. This is the last thing this is the last slide. Attachment is a function of the sacred mutuality of God's creation. There's no life without attachment. But loss tears at that fabric. And so grieving can be thought of as engaging in the creative work of God. You ever thought about grief that way? Grief might be thought of as engaging in the creative work of God. To honor loss by feeling its pain, while also discovering healing and hope in the process. Now how that all happens is a topic for another day. But today, I just wanted us to think about all the many losses that happen in our life, how we work through them, how others help us get through them. And when we can recognize them in others and help that process along, how that's holy work and healthy for us as individuals. Whether we think it might be a small loss or a big loss, either way, walking with one another through those times is good, holy, and sacred work. So that's end of what I'm going to talk about. Any quick questions? Good. You're all just soaking it in, or you're like, the game started 10 minutes ago, let's go. Tom, I know you didn't want to say it.
I'm here.
No, I do appreciate it. Yeah, so thank you for that, and thank you for coming and being a part of this and being willing. I know that each of you have experienced loss, deep loss, in some way or shape or form. And so I think that community is one of the key things that helps us process loss. You know, other people walking beside us, helping us along, picking us up when we fall down. All those things are just so vital to being able to walk through. So thank you very much.
Thank you.